A moment that will be familiar to thousands of anxious families. And now the baleful impact of coronavirus has been driven home to the country after Boris Johnson was admitted to intensive care. Across the river from Downing Street at St Thomas's Hospital, the decision was made to move the Prime Minister after his condition worsened this afternoon. Downing Street has indicated that he remains conscious but was admitted to intensive care in case he needs ventilation to aid his recovery. At just after 8 p.m, Downing Street issued a medical bulletin unprecedented in the modern era. The statement announced that the Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab would stand in for the Prime Minister. Just over an hour later, a sombre Foreign Secretary made an appearance.
Well, since Sunday, the Prime Minister's been under the medical care of the team at St Thomas's Hospital after he was admitted with persistent coronavirus symptoms. During the course of this afternoon, the Prime Minister's condition worsened, and on the advice of the medical team, he was moved in to a critical care unit. So in light of those circumstances, the Prime Minister asked me as First Secretary to deputise for him where necessary in driving forward the government's plans to defeat coronavirus. And as you'll know, he's been receiving excellent care at St Thomas's Hospital, and we'd like to take this opportunity as a government to thank NHS staff up and down the country for all of their dedication, hard work and commitment in treating everyone who's been affected by this awful virus.
The Foreign Secretary, who was asked by the Prime Minister to deputise for him shortly before he entered intensive care, pledged to deliver on the Prime Minister's goals.
There's an incredibly strong team spirit behind the Prime Minister and making sure that we get all of the plans that the Prime Minister has instructed us to deliver, to get them implemented as soon as possible. And that's the way we'll bring the whole country through the coronavirus challenge that we face right now.
From across the political spectrum and across the world, one voice united in wishing the Prime Minister well.
This is first and foremost a personal problem. You know, many of us are good friends of Boris's. We've known him for a long time, and we think very much about his family now at this particular point. Kerry's obviously expecting, and all his children and etc. will wonder about what's happening. So my thoughts and obviously our prayers are with him and his family, and we hope that this is a short period and he will get through this with the best care. So that is the first personal point. But in the wider point, the political part of it, that is to say the Conservative Party and other parties, honestly, genuinely, this is not a time for party politics or internecine squabbling. This is a time more than ever that people must pull together and accept that this vicious, ghastly virus, which has killed already far too many people and caused endless problems to others and is now attacking our Prime Minister, we really have to get through this.
A former Cabinet Secretary noted the gravity of the moment.
It's very, very sad news, and of course, we all hope that all's going to turn out all right, and it's obviously right to take the precautions, but we're bound all to be disturbed by it. And of course, we've got to remember the government is a very extensive machine. It doesn't depend on one person. There is nothing that the Prime Minister can't delegate if he chooses to, or if he's obliged to do.
An alarming time in the seat of British power. For the moment, the nation's and indeed the world's thoughts and prayers are focused across the River Thames at St Thomas's Hospital.
That was Nick Watt, and we'll take a look at the political implications in just a moment with our guests. But first, what do we know about why COVID patients end up in intensive care? Our health correspondent Deborah Cohen explains.
What we know is that Boris Johnson has been taken into intensive care, and this is a specialist hospital unit. It doesn't necessarily mean he's having more invasive treatment, but he'll certainly be having constant monitoring, and that's things like pulse, blood pressure, your oxygen, and all his vital organs. They'll be keeping an eye on that. The other thing with intensive care is the staff ratios tend to be higher, so it tends to be one nurse who looks after one or maximum two people. And the latest data from the UK suggests that the average age in intensive care units in this country is 60, and they do tend to be male. It's obviously totally unfair to speculate what will happen next, because we simply don't know. But I think it's fair to say that over the next few days, things will become clearer about the Prime Minister's health.
Deb Cohen there. Well, joining us now, former Chief of Staff to Tony Blair, Jonathan Powell, and Guto Harri, Boris Johnson's former Chief of Staff when he was a London mayor. Guto, a lot of people are understandably shell-shocked by this news tonight. Are you worried about him?
Yes, it's clearly a very serious deterioration. Just a week ago when he'd heard he'd had the virus, he was very upbeat, very bullish. He was going to just brush it off, get on with life. So clearly there's been a serious deterioration for him to succumb, if you like, to intensive care. He will be personally mortified to be on his back at a time like this. You could see on Thursday that he wasn't well, but he was determined to be outside the door of number 10, clapping for the NHS staff, determined to be seen to be chairing cabinet, determined to be seen to be leading from the front.
You know him well. You've been at his side. Does he take his health seriously? Does he listen to doctors?
I've never known him to be ill. When I worked very closely with him for 4 years, he was never ill, never seemingly tired. He's a man of enormous energy. He always used to get up very early, devour newspapers, go for a morning jog, cycle everywhere, didn't eat very healthily. And I think what's happened this week is he does worry. He will have been awake at night worrying about the massive judgment calls he's had to make, balancing lives and livelihoods. He will have been tortured by the idea that this is an overreaction. Clearly not the case, but he will have been worrying about shutting down the economy and potentially overreacting, and all that worry, not eating very well, being on his own, being lonely, worrying about his partner and baby-to-be and all the rest of it. It's not a recipe for your body getting the chance to fight something as vicious.
You spoke to him quite recently. Did he tell you he was worried about that? I mean, he's been making obviously huge strategic decisions on behalf of the whole country recently. Did he voice some of those concerns to you?
The main thing that comes across with Boris all the time is this irrepressible optimism that we will get through. And that's what he projects, that's what he believes, that's what he tells himself constantly. And that's what he was like about a week ago when he knew that he had the virus. He thought he'd get through it and Britain would get through it and we'd all be fine. This clearly shows just how serious it is.
Were you one of those saying, you've got to slow down? I mean, I know you say you've never seen him ill before, but up until this afternoon, it sounded like he wanted to keep his hand very much on the tiller. He was directing it. Do we know what happens now?
Well, literally you'd have to prise his hand off the tiller, which seems to be what happens when you're taken into intensive care. Because in the end, if you have the sort of drive and the energy that it takes to become Boris Johnson, and just look at the grueling year he's had, from the toppling of Theresa May to winning an election, to trying to get Brexit done, to that being delayed, having a general election, there's barely been downtime at all. And throughout all that, he will have operated on the basis that nobody else would bring the urgency, the determination, the sense of purpose to it, capable though many of his lieutenants are.
So when you say nobody else, I mean, he has deputised now, or at least the phrase is deputise when necessary to Dominic Raab. Is there a nervousness then about him letting go of any of these decisions?
I think there will be, because hopefully he's going to be only in a bad place for a few days and he'll be back on his feet. But he will know that history will hold him responsible if we've made a wrong judgment call on this, if we've overreacted or if we were too slow and we underreacted. And he will know and feel it intensely that there's no way he can turn around and say, well, I wasn't feeling very well, so I deputised it to Dominic Raab. The big judgment calls he'll want to be responsible for himself.
We don't, as in the US, have a sort of a particular amendment which kicks in when the person in power is incapacitated. So he has presumably chosen Dominic Raab knowing that this eventuality could happen. Does this now mean, I mean, just talk us through what you understand, does this now mean that Dominic Raab is able to make decisions on behalf of the UK government from here on?
I doubt whether the conversation would have occurred in such frank, forthright and clear terms as that. I think it would have been, well, if I can't be around for a few days, then you lead because you're the First Minister. But it's a cabinet, and this is the issue with our system. They're all equal, essentially, the great offices of state, it's only the Prime Minister who stands above the rest. So in rank, to be honest, no matter what title he has tonight, Dominic Raab is there alongside the Home Secretary, alongside the Chancellor of the Exchequer, alongside somebody like Michael Gove. And it's a tricky situation if it's an ongoing one where one person who's equal to his colleagues has got to sort of edge ahead of them. It doesn't really work. Not to mention the huge character that we have and the very personal nature of the mandate that was given at the last general election. It wasn't a mandate for a team or a party as such. It was a mandate for an individual that people recognised by his first name.
So without Boris Johnson, it gets much more difficult.
Well, if it was a prolonged period of time, it would get very difficult, yes.
Let me turn to Jonathan Powell. We've actually never been in this position before, Jonathan. Just trying to work out the ramifications is incredibly sensitive. But you were at Tony Blair's side when he was taken into hospital whilst in power. Very, very different set of circumstances. But just talk us through the kind of conversations that were going on then and what was going through his advisors' minds at a time like that.
Well, as you say, this is a different situation and it's very worrying, and everyone's first thought will be with Boris Johnson and hoping that he recovers speedily and that his family's worries will be put to rest. So we all hope that. In the case of Tony Blair, he went into hospital twice with his heart condition and had to be sedated and had to be operated on, but that was in and out very quickly in 24 hours. And I remember that Jack Straw, who was making the statement for him in the House of Commons after the heart operation, came into Downing Street so he could say that he'd spoken to Tony Blair before he then went out and made his statement in Commons. So it was less dramatic, less intense. But the same thing happened with Mrs. Thatcher when she went into hospital as well for an eye operation. This happens with prime ministers, but this obviously is much more serious, much more severe.
So what are the kind of conversations you're having then behind the scenes at a time like this? I mean, do decisions just get automatically put on hold? If you were in an emergency, a health crisis like this one, what would you now be thinking?
Well, you can't put decisions on hold, and things like the nuclear button have to be looked after and someone has to be responsible for them. So there is a series of decisions that will need to be made. The problem here is that although the system is very resilient, and as the former Cabinet Secretary Robin Butler was saying to you, there is a team of ministers, there are a team of civil servants who can keep things going. But we have a leader, we have a prime minister, and there are two key functions. One is to make those difficult decisions. And now we're approaching the decision about how we exit this lockdown. How will we actually get the economy going again? And that will be a very difficult decision for a stand-in to make for Boris Johnson instead of him to make it himself. The second thing the Prime Minister has to be is the explainer-in-chief. He has to be up there on the screen, telling people what's happening, carrying them along with him. And without a Prime Minister doing that, with a stand-in, it will be very difficult to continue for a long time.
How frank do you think you want to be or you should be with the public at this time? It's hugely worrying for the public, and the Chief Medical Officer this afternoon invoked the Hippocratic Oath, understandably, said it would breach patient confidentiality to talk about the Prime Minister's health. Does that still feel right when you're talking about the man who's running the country?
Well, again, there's precedent for that. Mrs. Thatcher kept it very quiet when she went into hospital, and with Tony Blair, again, we kept it very quiet. In these circumstances, I think, however, certainly more transparency would be sensible. You can actually worry people more by keeping it too quiet. We're not the Kremlin. You're not going to keep these things completely silent. I think, given that this is a sickness that's affecting many people, a certain degree of greater transparency would make more sense. You don't need to go into the details of Boris Johnson's condition, but you do need to carry people with you and to reassure them. The main function of the Prime Minister in these circumstances is to reassure people, to have confidence, to show people there's a way out, that he has a plan. And that's what's going to be lacking with no Prime Minister in place.
And so Dominic Raab now, is he the decisions man or is he the point man?
Well, that's going to be a problem too, because of course Dominic Raab is Foreign Secretary, and he will not be across the details of these medical issues and the supply issues in the same way that the Prime Minister was, and of course the Health Secretary and others were. So it's going to be difficult for him to catch up on the details of these decisions. But in principle, as the person standing in for the Prime Minister, he will need to make these decisions, because one person in the end needs to decide, and he'll need to be able to explain them to the people and give people confidence. It's a very big ask for someone coming from the position of Foreign Secretary to do that.
There's a huge amount of goodwill, Guto, for the Prime Minister and his health this evening. Do you think Dominic Raab can take the public with him on this one? Or, I mean, you were suggesting it is going to be a complication between the sort of team members that are left now.
Yeah, I don't think it's a substitution. It's not the understudy taking over from the lead actor here. I think it's going to be more of a team that you'll see going forwards. We have a Chancellor of the Exchequer who has, in a remarkable period, only been in his job a few weeks, but has inspired a lot of public confidence. A very able health minister as well, health secretary in Matt Hancock. So the team, I think, will be holding it together a lot more. It won't just be a swap Boris for Dominic Raab.
Thank you very much, Chief Advisors, both. Thank you. Let's